But now we get down to verse 18, and we're going to talk about a couple of things. We might get to the Sabbath thing, which would lead us over into chapter 3, but we may not, because we've got a lot of wine subject material to cover today. Verse 18, and it starts out, it's a little bit of a surprise, maybe, where this passage takes us. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. So we still had people who were following John, some of whom had broken off and followed Jesus. And John and Jesus' discipleship training weren't in opposition to one another, because John was talking about the Messiah coming, and Jesus was talking about him being the Messiah and being God, in fact. So there's not a schism there between John's disciples and Jesus' disciples at this point, and the Pharisees. So we don't often think of the Pharisees and disciples of John having anything in common, but they were both in the process of fasting. Now, we're not going to talk a whole lot about fasting today, partly because it's been way too long before I have engaged in that. I really think that the spiritual disciplines that we all should engage in is regular fellowship with other believers, regular Bible reading, giving, the discipline of giving, and I believe that fasting is on that list as well. And I'm going to try to get back on track with that. It's not that difficult to do. The Pharisaic fast wasn't that tough. They would not eat for supper, and then they wouldn't eat till the next supper. So half of that fast was while they were sleeping. And that's not that tough to do. But as we have talked about in the past, there are other ways to fast. You can fast from coffee. You can fast from Facebook. You could fast from perhaps an emotional reaction that you tend to have too much, need to be more aware of. But it's something that should cause some discomfort. And the goodness of fasting. Now, I talk a lot about coffee. I'm not really a coffee fanatic as much as you think. I probably have 3 cups would be typical. 2 would not be unusual. 4 cups would be, I probably would do that in most days. But I would notice if I didn't have my coffee. And so if I were to fast from coffee, which is one exercise that I've done, it's kind of a weenie way to fast, but it is something. But if I gave up my coffee, I would certainly be aware of it, because it's a habit of mine, it's a comfort of mine, and perhaps a physical addiction. I don't know. But it would cause discomfort, and so it would remind me, okay, here's a pain, here's a desire, here's a discomfort. That's a cue to pray, to remember to pray. And I would probably pray for coffee, but the point is that you do something to discipline yourself and deprive yourself of. So they were engaged in this discipline, and I think from the context of Scripture, Jesus always speaks, as well as some of the apostolic writings, as though fasting is a given. You guys are going to fast. When you fast, do this. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. People came and asked him, why do John's disciples and the Pharisees, who were, these were the spiritual elite at the time, fast, but your disciples do not fast? And this gave Jesus an opportunity to teach about some principles. Jesus said to them, the wedding guests cannot fast while the groom is with them. Can they? So again, to put a little cultural context in here, if in the weddings of the day were like 7 days long. It was a feasting, drinking celebration. It wasn't an hour and a half and then off they are to the honeymoon. So in fact, it was against rabbinic law to fast during a wedding feast, because you were supposed to be celebrating. And so Jesus said, if you're going to a wedding, you're not going to be fasting. They can't fast while the groom is with them. As long as they have the groom with them, they cannot fast. But the time will come when the groom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast on that day. So a couple things that Jesus is doing here, besides just having an illustration and teaching them about the legalism that they were involved in. One of them is in the Old Testament, when there was a comparison of the bride and groom in marriage in the covenant relationship, it was between God as the groom and Israel as the bride. And so when Jesus called himself the groom, who was he identifying himself as? God. And of course, we understand now that in addition to Israel, because the gates of grace have been opened, we, the church, are now the bride of Christ. And there was a little bit of prophecy there. Nobody in that audience expected that Jesus' life would end at age 33 and within a fairly short period of time. And so he gave a little bit of glimpse. There'll be a day, I'm not going to be with you forever. I'm not going to be with you forever. So in order to illustrate the issue of the Pharisees particularly, and John's disciples, they were still under the Old Testament and the law. And so Jesus was very faithful to the Old Testament law as well, in addition to fulfilling it in spirit and truth. And so they were fasting according to the tradition. There were two sets of religion really happening with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and perhaps even John's disciples. And that is what God really required under the law in the Old Testament. And there were the literally hundreds of rules that were established by the Pharisees over the years about how to apply and define the Old Testament law. And while the Old Testament law provided a lot of richness and closeness to the Lord in intent and an emphasis on the heart of worship, not just the things that you do, but they all had meaning, the Pharisaic laws had evolved to a place where obeying all of those rules was their religion. And how many in America today and across the world have taken the teachings of Scripture and have interpreted and added to and imposed decisions about how to behave, and trying to understand how God would want us to behave is absolutely an essential part of Christian growth. I don't deny that at all. But there comes a point when the religion becomes a religion of obeying the rules and not having a heart towards living like Jesus for his sake and his glory. And this is where the Pharisees had completely separated themselves in their heart and soul and mind from God's intent in establishing the Old Testament rules of worship and behavior, and had moved into an arena of just rule following for the sake of rule following. We were doing a little bit of research, and by research I mean Google, about the Amish, because in mid-Missouri where we were visiting, there are several Amish communities and other permutations of the Amish. And one of the things that Cheryl discovered is that, and again, I don't know if this is true among all the sects of that particular religious practice, but you didn't really know until you reached the judgment if you had been good enough to get into heaven. Yeah, I am so thankful I don't have to live that way, because that makes a religion of rules. It makes a religion of behavior, and it makes a religion of fear, and it makes a religion of guilt. And with all due respect for our Amish brethren. So here's what Jesus launches into as a response to this general principle of, why aren't you doing what our rule book says that you're supposed to be doing? He says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. Otherwise, the new patch pulls away from the old cloth and a worse tear is made. I think all of us kind of see that. I'm not sure that there's a whole lot of patching that goes on these days. We just throw away our $10 Walmart jeans and get a new pair. Yeah, now you all want to know where I can get jeans for $10, right? Well, just, or you buy them pre-patched and pre-torn, right? This is where I go into my old man rant about why people dress that way. So we may not have experienced patching. Now, when I was growing up, we patched, right? I had hand-me-downs, and we patched. Did y'all ever wear patched clothing? Okay. Remember Dolly Parton's song? So it was part of the culture in my growing up, maybe not so much now, patching. So I think we kind of understand that. So I won't talk a whole lot more about that because it's self-evident. But Jesus' point was, of course, is there's old stuff and there's new stuff, and you got to choose one or the other and match it, right? So now he tells this wine thing, and this is where we as Southern Baptists traditionally get really nervous. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is lost as well as the skins, and no new wine. He says, no new wine is put into fresh wineskins. Let me give you a little bit of liquor history. In the day, there were basically three types of grape type wine. One was the very new and fresh, basically grape juice that was unfermented. And this is what the denominations like Seventh-day Adventists and traditional Southern Baptists, at least from the 1880s on, we'll talk about that, cling to justify their total abstinence position. How many of you read routinely as a responsive reading, or had inside of your bulletin, or inside your on the back of your bulletin, or the inside of your hymn book, the church covenant? The church covenant. Okay. I love it that Baptists are very clear at saying we are not a creedal people. And by the way, you need to read this Baptist Faith and Message and the covenant, and yeah, we all have to explain what we believe. But one of the tenets of the church covenant that is often read includes we will abstain from the use of alcohol as a beverage. All right, which made me a big fan of NyQuil. But so let me talk about the history of being abstinent from alcohol as a Baptist. Now, out here, we really don't care. I don't know that anybody would feel like if they caught me drinking a beer, which I just don't have a taste for, so that won't happen, or drinking wine. I don't have a taste for that, so that won't happen. But if somebody caught me, see, there's my language, drinking an alcoholic beverage back in Missouri, it would be like I was shooting up or something. And out here, it's just not a cultural taboo. I don't imagine. And people have asked me. A couple of years ago, I was talking to somebody who was contemplating coming to church here and maybe even membership, and they said, "Well, now we have some beer in our house. And we have occasional beer. Is that any problem?" And it's not. Okay. Now, am I a proponent of abstinence from alcohol? Absolutely. Are there dangers even with social casual use of alcohol? Yes. Can it be a stumbling block to those who strongly believe in abstinence? Yes. But the Bible does not teach abstinence. So I'm not preaching against abstinence. There was there were two movements that happened. One in the 1700s over in England, when In fact, did you know that a prominent Baptist was the first one to brew or to distill bourbon whiskey?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, and he accidentally had some charcoal scarred wooden barrels, and so he was too cheap to throw them away. So he put his whiskey in there to distill and age, and he kind of liked the flavor. And of course, the abstinent Baptist will say, "Well, I hope he got used to burning smell, because that's where he is right now." So in the 1700s in Europe, um, they started distilling hard liquor. Now, for those of you that are not chemists or don't read the label on your liquor bottles, typically beer is 3 to 6% in alcohol by volume, right? Some of you remember the days when 3.2 beer was legal for 18-year-olds, right?
Yes.
And okay, some of you fondly remember those days. And then wine is typically somewhere between 8 on the low end to 12 to 15% typically. All right, and then over that you get the harder stuff, what we consider distilled beverages or hard liquor, whiskey, rum, rye, and all those kind of things. Well, and there have been a lot of jokes. I told you the joke about not recognizing each other in the liquor aisle, but there was also another. You always want to take at least 2 Baptists with you when you go fishing, because if there's only one Baptist, they'll drink all the beer. If you got a witness, they won't. So anyway, so that kind of liquor, corn liquor, started becoming into prominence in the late 1700s and 1800s, and that's when the slums and the poor areas, it was cheaper than wine, and so it became a real problem, a great deal of addiction and abuse. Part of Booth's ministry when he started the Salvation Army was to help intervene with this alcohol addiction in the slums of Europe, the United Kingdom. So abstinence was not necessarily for most Protestant groups, including Baptists. And we didn't really split into Southern Baptists until around the Civil War over obviously sad reasons. But there began to be an abstinence movement that started in the post-Civil War era. In fact, do you all remember the name Carrie Nation? Yeah. She actually grew up about 10 miles from Warrensburg, where we live. She's from Holden, Missouri, a little town in Missouri. And so that abstinence movement, the women's temperance movement, became very prominent, and Baptists got onto that. And so we began to advocate temperance. And there are some, and you may know this, there are some who blame the rise of organized crime on Baptists.
Oh, okay.
And why is that? Because we pushed for prohibition, and prohibition gave a monetary incentive for illegal alcohol production, because the demand for alcohol didn't go away just because it was a constitutional amendment to make it illegal.
Yeah.
So that created the rise of organized crime and of course stock car races too. Right, because that's based on the booze runners, rum runners back in the day. So we didn't, as a denomination, embrace temperance and abstinence from alcohol until the late 1800s, and we pretty much stuck with it for the most part. And by the way, we all look at prohibition as a failure, but if you look at the rates of incarceration, violence in the family, criminal activity other than running booze, and mental illness, they all went down during Prohibition. And so it wasn't completely a failure. It's just you can't, in a democracy, you cannot enforce laws that most of the people don't want to be enforced, right? But we also tax the stuff. And, believe it or not, we thought, not me, because I knew better, but the public was convinced that when we legalized marijuana, the underground marijuana market would disappear. It has not. There's still being untaxed marijuana being smuggled into the country. And so that's another issue. But it's this idea about wine gets a little bit colored by our denominational and family preferences. My family, we had no alcohol in the house. My mom's dad was a drunk. She never gave him the dignity of calling him an alcoholic. He would come and visit, and I've told you this before, you may remember. He would occasionally come to visit by the grace of my mother, who wanted to honor her father. But he would come, and when we started noticing that the mouthwash and the isopropyl alcohol started to disappear, it was time for him to leave the house. And so there are a lot of reasons why we have some of these views about when Jesus talks about wine. But wine in the Old Testament and New Testament was an important part of the culture. And there is this argument that they had to drink wine because the water was bad. There's truth to that. There's truth to that. But it was a very normal part of the beverage. But here's the thing. And that wine was really a lot less strong back in those days. That wasn't really wine. And I remember a frothy mouth evangelist preaching at a revival. You told me that my Jesus had that rotten grape juice in his mouth. I tell you, he never did touch that stuff. I'm like, well, you're wrong, buddy, but just tell me about Jesus. But there was one category of three basic categories of wine in this age that was basically fresh grape juice. And of course, that's the kind of wine that Jesus turned the water into during the wedding at Cana. The other wine was the pretty typically consumed product, which was made from fermented grape juice. And then the other kind of wine was the really high-powered, high-alcohol content, which was made from a lot of other fruits, dates and figs and those kinds of things, in addition to grapes. And it was high-alcohol content. And where you remember in Proverbs where it says wine is a mocker and strong drink is raging. Strong drink was that third category that was not well thought of. So when they made wine in those days, they would take the grapes, and if you've ever watched the Lucy show, that was sometimes processed by stomping the grapes off, and then you would put that stuff into a filter so that all of the chaff and rinds and all that kind of stuff, I don't know, grape skins, seeds would be filtered out. Then you'd have the pretty strong liquid. You would mix that with water at a ratio of about 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. And then the resulting alcohol content as it fermented would be 1 to 2%, maybe 3%. Okay, so it was a weaker product. But the Bible talks about being drunk on wine, so it did have a potential intoxicating effect at certain levels. So now to process that wine, you took the grape juice, you probably added either some natural yeast. Now the current way that wine is made, you put some chemicals and some flavors and some yeast in it. And it would get to that much higher alcohol content than this day. All of these ingredients were basically natural. I mean, there was no Dow Chemical Company back then. So it was basically natural ingredients, but they knew that it was a fermentation process. So they would take the skin, typically of a goat, and they would scrape it and process it, and it was still pliable and fresh. And then they would sew it together in basically a waterproof or liquid-proof type of format, and send this fresh, viable goat skin. Cheryl and I were talking about this the other day. We were listening to some orchestra music from the 1700s and 1800s that were written then, and we get to thinking about Billy, did you ever play an instrument that was strung with actual catgut? Yeah. Have you thought about the fact that every instrument in those old orchestras were just animal intestines? Every stringed instrument? Yeah. To me, it says that man has an innate need to make music and to love music. I'm not a musician per se, particularly compared to the others in my family. But there's something very God-inspired about music that we would want to take bones and animal skins and catgut and try to make music with it. So that's just a little totally unnecessary aside. But we're so separated in modern days from animal products, aren't we? I remember my mom and her mom, we had hogs. We usually sent them off to be processed, but one time Mom decided that she and Nellie were gonna render a hog. So we had a few days of process where my folks rendered a hog. And the key to hog production is nothing goes to waste, right?
Except the oink.
Yeah, except the oink, right. And so we're so used to chemical things and plastic things and those kind of containers that it's hard for us to identify with this. So here's this fresh animal skin. You put the wine in it, and you know what fermentation does? It expands. Some gases are released, and so that skin would expand, and the gases would find its way out in a few different places that liquid couldn't go, and you would have this aging fermented process that happened right there in the skins. And so once that skin was used one time and was already expanded, then when it was empty, it became brittle and useless. And so if you wanted to say, well, I'm going to reuse this, anybody wash out their plastic Glad bags? Okay. So, all right. So you couldn't do that with the wine sacks. They were useless. So if you did put new wine in an old wine skin, you would lose the old wine skin and the new wine. All right. So basic lesson here is you can't mix the old with the new. No new wine is put into fresh wineskins. How many times do others, and you can look in the mirror if it's appropriate, how many times do others say, this is my lifestyle, this is my set of values, these are my habits, this is my pattern of behavior, this is my worldview, I'm going to add a little Jesus to that. And Jesus said that does not work. Yeah. And what does the Bible say? We are a new creation. The old man is gone away. You have a renewed mind in Christ. So I would challenge each of us, including the man in the mirror. What are some old things that we're clinging to, that we're trying to put Jesus into and justify our holding on to the old things that need to be gone away? We don't like change. I've often, told you about being saved as a young child. I can't imagine being 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 and having a conversion experience and have to change my whole life and my whole worldview and my whole set of habits. That's the old wineskin. You can't pour Jesus into that and expect a good product to come out of it. How many of you had conversion experiences relatively late in life? I'm talking 20s, 30s. Okay. Was it easy? The refreshing is easy. Sometimes people have dramatic conversions and they talk about a weight lifting and just the things of the world will grow strangely and dim, dim in the light of His glory and grace. And it was just easy to walk away like the next day. We all have to go through changes, when you get married, life changes. When you get old, life changes. When you get fired from your job, life changes. That one I got used to. So we all resist change, right? And that's been the criticism of the church for years, is that you gotta get with it, you gotta change, and many of us are resistant to that. But the point is, we can't mix the old and the new. Now, when Jesus said that, He didn't say you've got to completely ignore everything from Genesis to what's the last book of the Bible?
Revelation.
Malachi. He didn't say that at all. And in fact, when he didn't fast, and later next week we'll talk about the disciples harvesting corn on the Sabbath and eating the wheat rather. Jesus didn't violate the Old Testament with His not fasting. He didn't violate the Old Testament with what the Pharisees accused Him of doing with the Sabbath. That was never the Old Testament requirement, to not heal, to not do good, to not eat, to not work necessary work. So I guess that's the question we have to ask ourselves. Are we living the renewed life with new wine and new wineskins?